You are standing in the middle of a city, but it looks almost nothing like what you expect. The street beneath your feet is not stone. It is packed earth, churned into brown mud by cartwheels, horse hooves, and the feet of thousands of people who move through this place every day. There are no sidewalks, there are no gutters in any meaningful sense. The houses press close on both sides, and their upper floors leaning toward each other until the sky above you narrows to a jagged strip of grey light. The smell is extraordinary, not entirely unpleasant if you have grown up here, but complex in a way that would overwhelm a modern visitor within seconds. This is Paris. The year is approximately 1180, and the man who is about to change nearly everything about it has just become king. His name is Philip. He is 15 years old. He has been co-crowned alongside his father, Louis VII, and partly because his father is ill, and partly because the French royal court is deeply worried about dynastic continuity. He will rule for the next 43 years, and when he dies in 1223, the city he leaves behind will bear almost no physical resemblance to the one he inherited. We call him Philip II Augustus, a title he earned, not one he was born with. And this is the story of what he actually did, street by street and wall by wall, lead to the city that would one day become one of the most recognizable in the world. To understand what Philip changed, you first need to understand what he found. In 1180, Paris was not yet the undisputed capital of France in the modern sense. The French king's territory, the Île-de-France, and its surrounding regions was surrounded on all sides by more powerful lords, the Count of Flanders to the north, the Duke of Burgundy to the east, and most significantly, the Plantagenet kings of England who controlled Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and a substantial portion of what we now call France. The French crown, at the moment Philip inherited it, was something closer to one powerful regional dynasty among several than an absolute national monarchy. The city itself was centered on an island in the Seine, the Ile de la Cité, which is still visible today as the heart of Paris, still containing Notre Dame, still connected to both banks by bridges. In 1180, this island housed the royal palace, the cathedral. Then, in the middle of the construction that would eventually produce the Gothic structure tourists visit today, and a dense tangle of streets, workshops, churches, and markets that made it the commercial and administrative core of the city. On the right bank of the Seine, the northern side, there was a growing zone of commerce. The Marais district, the area around the future Les Halles, and the riverfront were all filling in with merchants, craftsmen, and the infrastructure of trade. This was where goods arrived from across northern Europe: cloth from Flanders, grain from Champagne, wine from further south. On the left bank, the southern side, there was something quite different. The intellectual and ecclesiastical institutions that would eventually give this area its identity as the Latin Quarter were beginning to form. These students and masters associated with the Cathedral School of Notre Dame were gathering in numbers that the church's facilities could no longer easily contain, a pressure that would contribute directly to the formal establishment of the University of Paris around 1200. But the streets connecting all of this, the streets that Philip's subjects walked every single day, were unpaved, unmapped, and in wet weather, practically impassable. Medieval chronicles from this period describe the mud of Paris in terms that range from inconvenient to catastrophic. The odor rising from the streets as horses and livestock churned the ground was sufficiently overwhelming that it reportedly disturbed the king in his palace. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is recorded fact. Philip, by some accounts, looked out at the streets of Paris from a palace window, witnessed this scene, and decided something needed to change. Just whether or not the anecdote is literally true, and historians are appropriately cautious about such personal detail stories from medieval chronicles, the physical evidence confirms that one of his earliest significant urban acts was ordering the paving of the main streets of Paris. This project, documented in sources from around 1185 to 1190, laid large, flat stones across the principal routes through the city, creating a durable surface that would survive for generations and radically alter the practicality of urban movement in wet conditions. This was not a small project. It required enormous quantities of cut stone, organized labor, and sustained royal attention and funding. And it was just the beginning. If the paving of the streets was Philip's first major urban statement, his second was far more dramatic in its physical scale and its long-term consequences. Between approximately 1190 and 1215, as Philip ordered the construction of a continuous defensive wall encircling Paris on both banks of the Seine. This wall, known in later scholarship as the Philippian Wall or the Wall of Philip Augustus, was not a repair of existing fortifications or an incremental addition to older structures. It was a systematic planned enclosure of the entire urban area, replacing whatever patchwork defenses the city had previously relied upon with a coherent military and administrative boundary. The wall stretched for approximately 5 kilometers on the right bank alone. On the left bank, a second circuit enclosed the growing academic and ecclesiastical neighborhoods to the south. The total enclosed area represented a significant increase over any previous definition of the city's limits, and the wall's construction effectively established, for the first time, a clear legal and physical distinction between Paris and the countryside beyond it. Why build a wall on this scale? In the political context is essential here. In 1190, Philip was preparing to depart on the Third Crusade alongside Richard I of England, his rival, his occasional ally, and in many ways, his dominant strategic threat. The two men had a famously complicated relationship, alternating between cooperation and outright warfare across the first decade of Philip's reign. Before leaving for the Holy Land, Philip needed to secure his capital against the possibility of attack during his absence. The wall was, in part, a precautionary measure born of that immediate political anxiety, but it was also something more structural. Philip had spent the years before the Crusade carefully expanding royal territory, asserting legal authority over lords who had previously operated with near-total independence, and building the financial and administrative infrastructure of a more centralized state. The wall around Paris was a physical expression of that project, a declaration that this city was the center of a territorial power, that it had boundaries worth defending, and that the king intended to defend them. The construction involved more than just walls. At the western end of the right bank circuit, Philip ordered the construction of a large defensive tower, the donjon of a new fortress that controlled the main road approaching the city from Normandy and the English-controlled territories to the west. This fortress was called the Louvre. The structure Philip built bears no resemblance to the glass and limestone museum complex you can visit today. It was a military installation, a massive round tower surrounded by a moat, serving as both a stronghold and a royal treasury. But its location, chosen by Philip precisely because it commanded the most strategically vulnerable approach to the city, is the location on which every subsequent iteration of the Louvre has been built. When you walk through the Louvre today, you are standing on ground that Philip chose for military reasons in the 1190s. Archaeological excavations carried out during the construction of the Grand Louvre in the 1980s and 1990s revealed the foundations of Philip's original tower, and they are preserved underground. visible to museum visitors who descend into the medieval section of the complex. This is one of the rare cases in urban history where you can stand directly over the decision-making of a medieval king and look at the physical evidence of his calculations. Philip was born in August 1165, the son of Louis VII and his third wife, Adele of Champagne. His birth was celebrated with unusual intensity because Louis had waited decades for a male heir. His previous two marriages had produced only daughters, and the question of Capetian succession had been a source of considerable political anxiety throughout his long reign. What we know of Philip's childhood is relatively limited, as is typical for medieval royal children. He was educated in the court environment, exposed from early age to the complex network of feudal relationships and church politics and dynastic competition that defined the world he would inherit. He appears to have been a sharp political observer from an unusually young age. Contemporary chronicles describe a young king who was calculating, patient, and willing to wait for advantageous moments rather than acting on impulse. He was not described as a particularly chivalric figure in the romantic sense. He was not celebrated primarily for personal military valor in the manner of Richard I, whose legend was built substantially on battlefield prowess. Philip's reputation, in the sources that survive, is that of a strategist and an administrator, someone who understood that durable power required institutions and infrastructure, not just victories. His marriages were turbulent. His first wife, Isabella of Hainaut, died in 1190 after giving birth to the future Louis VIII. His second marriage, to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1193, it became one of the most complicated matrimonial disputes of the medieval period. Philip attempted to annul the marriage almost immediately after the wedding ceremony, for reasons that historians have never been able to fully explain. Contemporary sources suggest he found her physically repellent, though this explanation may itself be post hoc rationalization. He married a third wife, Agnes of Andechs, without obtaining a valid annulment, which placed him in direct conflict with Pope Innocent III and resulted in France being placed under an interdict, a suspension of most church sacraments across the entire kingdom, for several years. The dispute dragged on for nearly 2 decades before a formal resolution was reached. This episode matters for understanding Philip not as a sentimental figure, but as a political one. He was willing to sustain an enormous amount of institutional pressure, from the papacy and from the French ecclesiastical hierarchy, from his own nobility, in pursuit of what he wanted. He eventually reconciled formally with Ingeborg, though the marriage remained cold. He kept Agnes as a companion until her death. He did not yield easily. His strategic patience is most visible in his long campaign against the Plantagenet Empire. Richard I died in 1199, leaving the English crown to his brother John, a far less capable ruler. And Philip spent the next 15 years systematically dismantling Plantagenet power in France, using John's political failures and the legal mechanisms of feudal law to strip him of territory after territory. By 1204, Philip had conquered Normandy. By 1206, he controlled most of the Angevin heartland. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214, in which Philip defeated a coalition of his enemies, including the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, secured these gains and established French royal dominance over the most significant noble opposition within the kingdom. The revenues from these conquests, and from the increasingly sophisticated royal administrative system Philip built to manage them, funded the urban projects in Paris. The Wall, the Louvre, used the market infrastructure at Les Halles. All of it was made possible by the financial transformation of the French crown that Philip engineered over 4 decades of rule. A city's streets and walls are its skeleton. Its markets are its circulatory system. Philip understood this with the practical clarity of someone who needed Paris to function as an administrative and commercial capital rather than simply a symbolic one. Among his most consequential urban decisions was the formalization and physical development of the market at Les Halles, the great central market of Paris that would define the city's commercial geography for the next 8 centuries. The market had existed informally in this area before Philip, but he organized it, enclosed it, and gave it the institutional framework: fixed trading days, established fees, deregulated stall arrangements that transformed it from an informal gathering into a permanent urban institution. Physical halls were constructed to shelter merchants and their goods. The crown collected revenues from market fees, which simultaneously funded further urban investment and tied the commercial prosperity of Paris to the interests of the royal government. This integration of commercial infrastructure with royal administration is characteristic of Philip's approach across many domains. He did not simply allow Paris to grow, he shaped its growth in ways that reinforced royal authority while also making the city more functional and prosperous. The merchants who traded at Les Halles operated under royal protection and royal regulation. Their success strengthened the crown. The crown's investment in the market's physical infrastructure strengthened the merchants. It was a reinforcing cycle, and Philip appears to have understood it as such. The streets that led to the market also mattered. The paved routes Philip ordered in the 1180s were in part about making commerce physically viable regardless of weather. When the roads from the city gates to the market were paved, and goods could move reliably through Paris in conditions that would otherwise have made wheeled transport impractical for weeks at a time. This is the kind of urban infrastructure decision that does not appear dramatic in isolation, but compounds enormously over time. Every merchant who moved goods through Paris during a wet autumn for the next 200 years was doing so in part because Philip had ordered stone laid in the street. The right bank of the Seine, and under Philip and in the decades following his reign, developed into the commercial heart of Paris in a way that it has essentially remained ever since. The Marais district to the east, the Les Halles area in the center, and the waterfront along the river all intensified as zones of trade, craft production, and merchant residence. The left bank, enclosed by Philip's Wall and home to the emerging university, or developed along a different but equally consequential trajectory, as an intellectual and ecclesiastical center whose distinct character from the right bank is still perceptible in Paris today. One of the most significant urban developments in Paris during Philip's reign was the formalization of the University of Paris. And while Philip was not its founder in any direct sense, his reign created the conditions under which it became possible, and the schools associated with Notre Dame had been attracting students and masters for decades before Philip became king. Figures like Peter Abelard had made Paris a center of scholastic debate in the early 12th century, drawing students from across Europe to hear lectures on theology, philosophy, and logic. By the late 12th century, the concentration of teachers and students in the left bank neighborhoods around the cathedral had reached a scale that required formal organization. The university received its first formal charter from Pope Innocent III, significantly not from the French crown, around 1200. Philip's contribution was more indirect but consequential. He granted the university community legal privileges that placed scholars under ecclesiastical rather than civil jurisdiction. This meant that students and masters could not be tried in ordinary royal courts, nor a protection that made Paris attractive to scholars from across Europe who might otherwise have been deterred by the prospect of local judicial entanglement. This decision reshaped the left bank of Paris. The concentration of thousands of students, young men mostly from across Europe, speaking a common academic Latin even when their vernacular languages differed completely, created a distinct urban neighborhood unlike anything else in Northern Europe. The booksellers, the taverns, was the cheap lodging houses, the spaces for public debate and lecture. All of this concentrated in the streets south of the Seine in ways that gave the Latin Quarter its particular character. The long-term urban consequence was profound. The University of Paris became one of the most important intellectual institutions in European history, and its presence on the left bank anchored that side of the river as an educational and cultural zone for centuries. The bookshops along the Rue Saint-Jacques, the academic institutions that cluster around the Sorbonne, the general character of the Fifth Arrondissement today, all of this flows in a direct institutional line from the decisions made during Philip's reign about where and how the university community would be organized. When Philip II Augustus died at Mantes in July 1223, he had been king for 43 years. The city he left behind was in measurable physical terms a different place from the one he had inherited. The streets in the city's core were paved. The city had a continuous defensive wall encircling both banks. It had a purpose-built royal fortress, the Louvre, at its western approach. It had organized, legally regularized markets at Les Halles. It had a university whose legal status and physical location on the left bank were secured. It had a cathedral, Notre Dame, that had been under construction throughout his reign and was approaching something closer to its completed form. The population of Paris during this period is estimated by historians at somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 people, though these figures are inherently uncertain given the nature of medieval demographic evidence. What is clear is that the city was growing, that its growth was being channeled by the infrastructure and institutions Philip had created, and that it was in the process of becoming the dominant urban center in what would become France. And Philip had also done something more abstract, but equally significant. He had made Paris the symbolic and administrative center of an expanding royal state. The French crown, when he inherited it, was a regional power surrounded by rivals. When he died, it was the most powerful political force in France, controlling directly or through feudal subordination a territory that would have been unrecognizable to his father. Paris was not, incidentally, the capital of this expanded domain. It was, in a meaningful sense, its expression. The investment Philip made in the city's infrastructure was also an investment in the idea that Paris was where France was governed, where its commerce was centered, and where its intellectual life was organized. This is what distinguishes Philip's urban legacy from mere construction. Buildings go up and come down. Now walls are torn down when they are no longer needed. Philip's wall was eventually demolished as Paris expanded beyond it in the 14th and 15th centuries, replaced by newer circuits that enclosed even more territory. Markets relocate, streets are rerouted. What persists is the logic of the city, the underlying decisions about where things go, why they go there, and what relationship exists between urban form and political power. Philip's decisions about the Louvre, about the market at Les Halles, about the legal status of the university, about the location of the main defensive circuit. These were not just construction projects. They were statements about how Paris should work, and many of those statements proved durable enough to shape the city for centuries after his death. If you walk through Paris today with Philip's city in mind, the traces are more present than you might expect, but they require a certain kind of attention to see. The Louvre is the most obvious. You can descend into the medieval section of the museum and walk around the foundations of Philip's donjon. The stones are 800 years old. The moat that surrounded them has been dry for centuries, but its outline is preserved in the archaeological exhibit. Standing in that space, you are standing inside Philip's military calculation, inside the decision he made in the 1190s about where the city needed to be defended. The subsequent centuries of building, there's expansion, Renaissance remodeling, royal enlargement, revolutionary appropriation, and modernist intervention have accumulated on top of that original decision, but they have not moved it. Sections of Philip's wall have been found scattered across the city, embedded in later construction, preserved in basements and parking garages and archaeological sites. The most complete visible sections are in the 3rd arrondissement. In the Marais district, some of the original stonework still stands at roughly its original height, incorporated into later buildings that simply built around it or on top of it. There is something quietly remarkable about a fragment of a 13th century defensive wall surviving in the basement of a building in a contemporary European city, still visible to anyone who looks for it. Les Halles, by contrast, is gone. Or rather, it was gone, and then erased again. The great central market that Philip formalized survived in various physical forms until the 1970s, when it was demolished in one of the more controversial urban interventions of 20th century Paris, replaced first with an underground shopping center, and later with the Forum des Halles, recently renovated into its current form. The location is the same. The function, a central commercial hub in the right bank core, is roughly the same. But the physical fabric that had accumulated across 8 centuries of market life was demolished within a decade. The university, too, has been transformed beyond recognition in its physical form while persisting in its location. The Sorbonne that exists today is a 19th century building. The medieval structures that housed the earliest university are long gone, replaced repeatedly as the institution grew, was suppressed during the Revolution, was re-established under Napoleon, and was reorganized again in the 20th century. But it is still on the left bank. The concentration of educational institutions in that part of the city, the grandes écoles, the research institutes, the bookshops, still reflects the spatial logic that Philip helped establish in the late 12th century. What disappeared most completely is the texture of daily life, the sounds, the smells, the physical experience of moving through those streets. We can reconstruct the plan of medieval Paris with reasonable confidence from maps, excavations, and documentary sources. We cannot fully reconstruct what it felt like to stand in the Rue Saint-Denis in 1200 as a cart loaded with cloth from Flanders made its way toward Les Halles on Philip's paved road, past houses whose occupants had never traveled more than 20 kilometers from where they were born, under a sky dense with the smoke of 1,000 hearth fires. That texture is gone, but the structure that organized it, the walls, the markets, the streets, the institutions, that structure persists in one form or another 800 years later in the city that millions of people navigate every day without knowing whose decisions they are still living inside. Philip II Augustus died in July 1223. He was 57 years old. He had spent 43 of those years as King of France, and he had spent a significant portion of that reign making decisions about Paris, where its walls would go, where its markets would be, what legal status its scholars would hold, what fortress would guard its western approach. He did not think of himself as an urban planner. He thought of himself as a king trying to secure power, defend territory, and build institutions robust enough to survive him. And the urban transformation of Paris was a byproduct, an enormously significant one, of those political ambitions. This is how most great cities are made, not through visions of ideal urban form, but through the collision of political necessity, economic opportunity, available resources, and the particular calculations of particular people operating in particular moments. Philip needed a wall because he was going to the crusade, and he did not trust his enemies. But he needed markets organized because he needed revenue. He needed the university protected because ecclesiastical allies were useful. Each decision was contingent, political, and pragmatic. Together, they made Paris. When you stand on the Pont Neuf and look toward the Ile de la Cité, toward Notre Dame, toward the Conciergerie, toward the dense urban fabric that still crowds the island, you are looking at something that has been accumulating for 2,000 years. The Romans were here first, yet the Frankish kings were here before Philip. The centuries after Philip added more: the Sainte-Chapelle, the expansion of the Louvre, Haussmann's boulevards, the Eiffel Tower, the Pompidou Center. But somewhere in the middle of all of that accumulation, there is Philip. There are his streets. There are the foundations of his tower. There is his wall, buried in the basements of the Marais. There is the university he protected, and still teaching on the left bank where it has taught for 800 years. He laid out the streets of medieval Paris, and in ways that most people walking those streets will never think about. He is still laying them out today,